July 6, 1944. Northern Saipan. A moon barely rises over the broken cane fields, casting pale light across a landscape torn open by 3 weeks of relentless fighting. The air is thick, unmoving, carrying only the soft hiss of waves far behind the American lines. For a moment, there is an eerie quiet, the kind that unsettles even veteran Marines. Along a shallow ridge near Tanapag Plain, 40 men lie in the dark. Their uniforms are stiff with dust and salt. Their rifles rest across their chests. Their faces show the exhaustion of a campaign fought yard by yard. They belong to a unit that shouldn't exist, a hand-picked platoon of brawlers, scouts, and troublemakers molded into something far more dangerous. Some were chosen straight from the Brig. All were chosen because Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky believed he could turn them into a blade. Out in the darkness beyond their wire, something begins to move. First a tremor, then a vibration across the earth, then the unmistakable sound of thousands of boots, sandals, and bare feet driving forward as one. A human roar starts to build, rising, spreading, deepening, as 3,000 Japanese soldiers surge toward a Marine line held by only hundreds, and toward a ridge held by just 40 men. And to understand how those 40 ended up here, poised to meet the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, we must step back into the wider story that brought this night crashing down upon them. By early 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined not by sweeping naval clashes, but by the slow, methodical swallowing of Japan's outer defenses. American commanders had realized that victory would not come from chasing every island across the world's largest ocean. It would come from seizing the right islands, airfields, anchorages, and stepping stones that allowed the next leap forward. This strategy, later known as island hopping, pushed the United States closer to Japan's inner ring. And by spring, attention had fixed on a chain of volcanic and coral peaks rising from the warm blue of the Central Pacific, the Mariana Islands. The Marianas meant airfields, and airfields meant the B-29 Superfortress, the long-range bomber capable of reaching the Japanese home islands. If the U.S. could capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the strategic equation of the war would change overnight. American planners knew it. Japanese commanders feared it. To both sides, the Marianas were not just islands. They were the hinge on which the entire war in the Pacific could turn. Saipan, the largest of the 3 main islands, became the immediate target. 22 kilometers long, ringed with cliffs and coral reefs, crowned by jungle-covered ridges and broken cane fields, Saipan was home to more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers, organized around the 43rd Division, the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, and naval personnel under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander whose carriers had once struck Pearl Harbor. By June, these units had dug themselves into the volcanic earth, preparing to defend every foot of terrain in the name of the Emperor. To them, Saipan represented the forward wall of Japan's homeland. Losing it meant admitting the unthinkable, that the war could be lost. On the American side, the responsibility for taking Saipan fell to the V Amphibious Corps under Marine Lieutenant General Howlin Mad Smith. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions would make the initial landings, followed by the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division as reinforcement. More than 71,000 American personnel would participate, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific to that point. Months of planning had gone into the landings, naval bombardments, aerial reconnaissance, hydrographic surveys of the reefs, but everyone involved understood a simple truth: none of it meant the battle would go smoothly. The landings began on June 15, 1944. At 7:00 a.m., the first wave of Marines pushed toward the island through choppy surf, their Amtraks bucking under Japanese shellfire. Naval guns thundered from offshore. Smoke drifted across the water. The assault soon became a chaotic struggle fought in waist-deep water and on narrow strips of sand littered with smashed landing craft. But Marine and Army infantry hammered forward, carving out beachheads under some of the fiercest resistance seen since Guadalcanal. Over the following days, U.S. forces pushed inland through sugar fields, ridges, ravines, and dense patches of brush. The fighting was intimate, unforgiving, and almost always close range. Japanese defenders counterattacked constantly, sometimes at night with infiltration teams armed only with grenades and bayonets, other times with coordinated movements of infantry and tanks. Yet gradually, American firepower, mobility, and combined arms coordination pushed the defenders back toward the northern end of the island. As the battle intensified, the cost grew. Casualty reports mounted. Heatstroke and exhaustion spread through rifle companies worn thin, but the Marines adapted. Units began to rely heavily on scouts, snipers, and small reconnaissance elements capable of slipping ahead of the main line, men who could feel the terrain, sense danger, and strike first. One such group, a hand-picked platoon under Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky of the 2nd Marine Division, began earning a reputation: tough, unpredictable, and lethal. Many were known troublemakers. Some had Brig records, but Tachovsky saw something else: aggression, fearlessness, and an instinct for surviving environments where hesitation meant death. By the final days of June, the Japanese defensive pocket around northern Saipan had compressed into a shrinking wedge of territory. Supplies dwindled, ammunition ran short, communications with the southern command posts broke apart, and within the leadership of the Japanese garrison, the conversation shifted from defending Saipan to dying on Saipan. This was the fragile, tightening world that set the stage for the largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War, and for the 40 men who would be waiting on a ridge as that final storm gathered force. By the first days of July 1944, Saipan's northern sector had become a landscape of ruin. Shell craters pocked the cane fields, burned-out tanks slumped beside shattered bunkers, palm trees stood peeled and splintered, their trunks blackened by explosions. And across this ravaged ground, thousands of Japanese soldiers, many wounded, all exhausted, fell back toward the last defensible positions around Tanapag and Makunsha villages. American forces pressed behind them. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had driven north in grinding advances, pushing through suicidal counterattacks and fortified ridgelines that turned every 100 yards into a deadly contest of fire and movement. The Army's 27th Infantry Division, despite suffering heavy losses and organizational chaos earlier in the battle, now filled gaps and secured the right flank. But even with overwhelming firepower, progress came only through relentless effort. Saipan had become a battle of attrition, and the Americans knew the enemy would not break easily. The Japanese command structure on Saipan had begun to unravel. Vice Admiral Nagumo, once a central figure in Japan's naval air power, now found himself cornered on land with no ships, no carriers, and no hope of evacuation. General Yoshitsugu Sato, responsible for the island's overall defense, understood by early July that the situation was hopeless. Supplies were virtually gone. Ammunition stores were depleted to the point where many infantrymen carried fewer than a dozen rounds. Medical stations overflowed. Communications units were nearly wiped out, forcing messengers to run through zones swept by American machine guns. Yet despite the collapse, one principle held firm among Japanese leadership: surrender was unacceptable. According to the code of Gyokusai, literally, shattered jewel defenders were expected to die in a final, all-out attack rather than submit. Saipan's situation made that expectation inevitable. For Sato, Nagumo, and the surviving officers, there would be no final defensive line, no last stand behind barricades. There would only be one last charge. The decision for the Gyokusai attack likely solidified between July 5th and July 6th. Orders went out in the darkness. Surviving soldiers were told to gather whatever weapons they still possessed: rifles, swords, bayonets, even sticks and farm tools. Some units had no ammunition left at all and prepared to fight hand-to-hand from the first moment of contact. Medics and rear-echelon personnel were pressed into frontline roles. Even wounded men capable of walking were ordered to join. For many, it was not a choice, but a command rooted in the military culture of the empire. American commanders sensed something was coming. Patrols returning from the forward edges of the line reported unusual movements, scattered shapes darting through the trees, bursts of activity in the ravines, the distant sound of shouted instructions. Marine units tightened their perimeters and checked weapons. Officers briefed their men on likely night attacks. Still, the scale of what was building in the shadows remained hidden. Along the front, Marine positions adjusted. Heavy machine guns were angled to cover expected avenues of approach. Mortar crews plotted defensive fires. Rifle companies shortened their lines to prevent infiltration. And scattered among these positions were small platoons like Lieutenant Tachovsky's, scouts and snipers accustomed to working quietly, moving ahead of the main body and striking without being struck back. His men, the 40 Thieves, had earned their name from their habit of appropriating anything useful from abandoned positions, tools, food, gear, and from their ability to make themselves vanish into terrain. Tachovsky had chosen them for qualities most officers avoided: defiance, aggression, and a refusal to quit under pressure. Men like that had rough edges, but on Saipan, rough edges kept you alive. As night approached on July 6th, the Marines prepared for yet another long stretch of tension and listening. Heat radiated from the ground even after sunset. The air smelled of cordite, diesel, and the faint sweetness of crushed cane. Somewhere in the dark ahead, Japanese troops gathered in enormous numbers, forming into lines that stretched across hundreds of yards. They stood in silence at first. Then officers moved among them, giving final orders, tying banners to poles, and urging men forward with promises of honor in death. And when the moment came, thousands of voices rose into a single thunderous cry that shook the air and rolled outward like a wave. A cry that was about to crash directly into the American lines, and into the path of 40 men standing on a low ridge, waiting for impact. This is where the story narrows again. Because to understand how this moment would test every angle of leadership, survival, and resolve, we must look more closely at the forces, human and tactical, converging on that ridge. 40 men on a ridge compresses identity. On Saipan, a man was not the sum of his past, but the sum of his reactions to fear, to exhaustion, to the knowledge that death waited in the dark just a few dozen yards away. The 40 Marines under Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky embodied this truth. Some had been misfits in garrison life, restless or defiant, men who clashed with routine and paid for it behind the bars of a Marine brig. But Tachovsky saw beneath the roughness. He saw men who didn't break easily. Men who fought fiercely, men whose instincts were sharp when rules and order fell away. By the time they reached northern Saipan, the platoon had been forged through reconnaissance missions, long nights without sleep, and patrols that crawled through ravines already thick with the smell of death. They trusted one another, not because of discipline manuals, but because in the worst moments someone had always stepped up, dragging a wounded Marine out of a thicket, spotting a sniper before he fired, or returning from a silent crawl forward with the information that kept the line alive. On the night of July 6th, these men lay in the dark with a clarity that soldiers sometimes describe only decades later, the sense that everything they were, everything they had ever done, had brought them to this precise place. There was fear, yes, fear is honest, and no Marine in the Pacific escaped it, but there was also something harder, more deliberate, a readiness. Because when thousands of voices began to roar across the plain, human instincts surged before orders did. And the question was not whether these men were perfect Marines, it was whether they could stand when the world came crashing toward them. The tactical angle, terrain, timing, and the shape of a charge. The Banzai attack of July 6-7 was not a random rush of bodies. It was shaped by terrain and necessity. The northern end of Saipan narrowed into a funnel, a shrinking zone of fields and broken villages hemmed in by ridges and cliffs. Japanese forces retreating into this pocket had no room left to maneuver. Their only remaining path ran directly into American lines stretched thin across a curve of land above Tanapag Plain. Under normal circumstances, charging across open ground toward entrenched firearms would be suicidal, but the Japanese commanders knew something about American positions. Marine and Army units were fatigued. Lines had become elongated as they pushed north. Companies were under strength. Some platoons had fewer than half their men, and the Americans did not fully grasp the sheer number of attackers gathering in the dark. The Japanese formation, though battered, had structure. Infantry units massed in depth with wounded and support personnel in the rear. Officers with swords positioned themselves along the line to drive momentum. Tanks, a handful of them still operational, prepared to move in the second wave to exploit any breakthrough. The plan was brutally simple. hit the line with overwhelming force in a single tidal surge, break through the weakest point, and crush the American rear. The Americans held the high ground on several ridges, including the position Tachovsky's platoon occupied. Elevation provided fields of fire, but it also made them a target. From below, Japanese soldiers could see the thin silhouettes of Marine positions outlined against the gray sky. And when the charge began, the momentum would build not as a scattered assault, but as a rolling wave of bodies, voices, and steel slamming into terrain already soaked with weeks of bloodshed. When the roar rose in the darkness, the tactical map of Saipan shrank to a single truth. 40 men stood in the path of a force larger than many entire regiments. The leadership angle, Tachovsky's judgment, and the value of misfits. Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky had not intended to build a platoon of men with jail time, but he understood something many officers struggled to accept: war rewards traits that peacetime punishes. Defiance becomes initiative. Aggression becomes force of action. A man who breaks rules can be a man who refuses to freeze under fire. During patrols earlier in the campaign, Tachovsky had watched how these men moved, how they reacted to sudden danger, how they read the land. When artillery began walking across cane fields, they didn't panic, they calculated. When an enemy ambush erupted from the brush, they were already moving toward better cover before commands reached them. They were imperfect Marines, yes, but nearly perfect fighters for the kind of combat Saipan demanded. Leadership under such conditions did not mean inspiring speeches, it meant clarity in chaos. Tachovsky positioned his men with deliberation, knowing their strengths. He trusted their instincts, and perhaps most importantly, he refused to let the fear of their pasts define how he used them in the present. On the night of July 6th, his leadership would matter more than any doctrine, because when thousands of enemy soldiers began to advance, it was Tachovsky's judgment, his ability to place the right men in the right place at the right moment, that determined whether the ridge would hold. And that judgment was about to be tested against the largest human wave assault of the Pacific War. Mindset, desperation, and the code of Gyokusai. For the Japanese soldiers preparing to charge, the night of July 6th was not simply a tactical maneuver. It was an existential moment shaped by culture, command, and a collapsing battlefield. Many of these men had been fighting without rest for nearly 3 weeks. They had watched comrades fall, one by one, under naval bombardments, strafing runs, artillery barrages, and close-range firefights that left no room for retreat. Morale wavered, but the expectations of the imperial system were unmistakable. Surrender was worse than death. Capture was dishonor not only for themselves, but for their families. The decision for Gyokusai, a final, total attack, was not made by soldiers, but by commanders who understood both the symbolic and practical weight of Saipan. The home islands were now within American bomber range. Japan needed a miracle. The men gathering at the line that night could not give one, but they could offer one last moment of defiance. Many carried no ammunition. Some had no rifles. Accounts from survivors describe men holding bayonets tied to sticks, medical personnel wielding scalpels and scissors, and lightly wounded soldiers hobbling into formation with only their courage and the certainty of their fate. Officers moved among them, shouting encouragement, invoking the emperor, raising swords in gestures meant to ignite the will of those who hesitated. These were not zombies or fanatics blindly charging. They were men who had been told that there was only one way forward, literally. And in their minds, the Banzai charge was less a tactic than a final duty, a way to give meaning to a doomed defense. When they surged into the night, it was with a mixture of desperation, determination, and a belief that they could, even in death, inflict a blow heavy enough to alter the American advance. The technological angle, firepower, ammunition, and the limits of small arms. Technology defines the boundaries of human action in war. On Saipan, the gulf between American and Japanese firepower was significant, but not always decisive. At night, in the confusion of a mass charge, even superior weapons could be overwhelmed. The Marines on the ridge carried a mix of M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and a limited number of sniper rifles. Some positions had Browning M1917 or M1919 machine guns, their cooling jackets and tripods dug into the volcanic soil. Mortar crews in nearby companies had pre-registered firing zones, allowing them to drop rounds onto likely avenues of approach without needing visual confirmation. But ammunition was finite. Units had been pushing forward for days, and resupply lagged behind the pace of the battle. Japanese forces, by contrast, were technologically depleted. Many rifles had no ammunition. Light machine guns were few, often damaged. Grenades were scarce. Their most dangerous weapons that night were not firearms, but momentum and mass. The ability of thousands of bodies to push across a battlefield faster than a single machine gun could mow them down. The physics of such an attack created terrifying dynamics. Once the first ranks began to run, the mass behind them pressed forward, compressing the wave into a dense column of motion. The initial burst of American fire could devastate the front, but the human tide behind it continued, stumbling over the fallen, rushing blindly toward muzzle flashes. In such conditions, a machine gun barrel could overheat, jam, or simply run dry. A rifleman could fire as fast as he dared, but the wave might still reach him before he reloaded. This technological imbalance, American superiority countered by Japanese mass, shaped the nature of the fighting on the ridge. The Marines would rely on accuracy, discipline, and careful use of ammunition. The Japanese would rely on numbers, speed, and will. The collision between these forces would reveal the razor-thin line between equipment and survival. Survival, duty, and the cost of close combat. In war, there are moments when morality ceases to be an abstract concept and becomes something raw, immediate, and personal. The Banzai attack on Saipan forced both sides into such a moment. For the Japanese soldiers, the charge was framed as honorable, a death worthy of the emperor. For the Americans standing in the path of the assault, it was a confrontation not only with danger, but with the human reality of killing at extreme proximity. Marines on the ridge understood the stakes. If the line broke, the attackers would not simply overrun positions, they would sweep into the aid stations, the rear echelons, the walking wounded, and anyone unable to defend themselves. The cost of failure was not strategic, it was immediate and lethal. To hold meant survival, to fail meant catastrophe. In this space of necessity, individual morality became entwined with duty. Marines who might have been reflective or hesitant in another environment found themselves firing into a mass of charging men whose faces were visible even in the dark. The choice was stark: kill or be killed along with everyone behind you. Such combat leaves marks that linger long after the smoke clears. Veterans of that night, from the 40 Thieves and from other units along the line, would remember the sounds most vividly. The screams, the impact of bodies hitting the earth, the metallic clatter of empty clips, the sudden, suffocating intimacy of hand-to-hand fighting. The moral weight did not come from choosing violence. It came from recognizing, in the chaos, that survival demanded it. And as the roar of the charge rose to its full, terrible strength, every angle, human, tactical, technological, and moral, converged on a single point of collision. A collision that would define the climax of the battle for Saipan. The first vibration came through the ground, faint as a distant drumbeat. Marines lying prone on the ridge felt it before they heard it, the subtle quiver of earth under thousands of synchronized footsteps. Then came the sound, low at first, like wind in a deep ravine. It grew quickly, becoming a rumble, a pulse, a living force moving through the night. Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky rose slightly from behind his position and listened. He didn't need binoculars. He didn't need a report. The human roar rolling across Tanapag Plain told him everything. This was no probing attack, no scattered infiltration. This was the Gyokusai, the final charge they had all sensed, but never fully imagined. To the men of the 40 Thieves, the darkness in front of them seemed to deepen. Shapes began to form, first as shadows, then as figures, then as a vast tide. The Japanese soldiers came in dense ranks, shoulder to shoulder, some running, others limping, some waving rifles overhead, others clutching sticks, knives, or nothing at all. Officers shouted orders, their voices rising above the roar, swords flashing in the faint moonlight. Tachovsky's voice cut through the tension, a simple command, calm, steady. Hold. Fire discipline mattered now more than ever. If they opened too soon, the ammunition would burn out long before the wave reached them. So the platoon waited. Their fingers rested on triggers. Their breaths came slow and shallow. Sweat trickled down their faces, mixing with dust and dried salt. The roar grew louder. The earth shook harder. Then a flare arced upward from a nearby marine company, blossoming into a harsh white glare that illuminated the plain. In that moment, the scale of the attack revealed itself fully. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were rushing forward in a sweeping, crescent-shaped formation that stretched across the width of the American line. The sight was overwhelming, a living tide, surging toward a few hundred defenders spread thinly across rough ground. Tachovsky didn't wait another second. Fire! The ridge erupted. Muzzle flashes tore through the darkness. M1 Garands cracked in steady rhythm. Bars hammered out fast, punishing bursts. Machine guns from adjacent marine positions opened up with deep, rhythmic pulses. Tracer rounds carved red arcs across the plain, slicing into the oncoming mass. The front ranks of the Japanese charge collapsed instantly, bodies dropping in rows. But the wave did not slow. It rolled forward over the fallen, driven by momentum, belief, desperation, and the press of thousands behind them who could not see the carnage ahead. Mortars from companies positioned behind the ridge fired blindly into the darkness. Rounds exploded among the attackers, sending fountains of dirt and bodies into the air. But still, the wave came on. The distance closed rapidly. At 70 yards, the charge began to take shape in terrifying detail. Marines could see individual faces, contorted with effort, fury, or pain. They could see officers waving swords. They could see wounded men hobbling forward, refusing to stay back. And through it all, the roar continued, a continuous cry that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The 40 Thieves fired with controlled precision. Every shot mattered. Garand clips pinged against stone. Empty magazines clattered to the ground. Bar gunners shifted position between bursts to avoid overheating. The air filled with smoke and the sharp smell of cordite. At 50 yards, the first Japanese grenades flew toward the ridge. Most fell short. A few exploded dangerously close, showering Marines with dirt and fragments. One man near Tachovsky took a piece of shrapnel in the leg, but kept firing, dragging himself into a new angle to cover a gap in the line. At 40 yards, the Japanese charge broke into a sprint. The wave's leading edge thinned into clusters of men rushing directly toward the American positions. Some fired rifles wildly from the hip. Others sprinted with bayonets raised. A few carried explosives strapped to their bodies. The ridge shook with the impact of bullets and the explosive thud of mortar rounds landing short. A machine gun team near the 40 Thieves worked feverishly to keep their weapon fed. Its barrel glowed a faint red in the darkness. At 30 yards, Tachovsky gave another order. Grenades! A chain of explosions erupted along the ridge as Marines hurled fragmentation grenades into the advancing masses. The blasts tore gaps into the charge, flinging bodies backward. But still, incredibly, impossibly, the wave kept coming. Now came the hardest moment, the moment every Marine recognized as the true test of a night attack. The enemy was close enough to reach them. Japanese soldiers began to climb the lower slope, scrambling over rocks and debris, silhouetted against the sky as they charged uphill. Marine fire dropped many of them before they could close the distance, but several broke through the last yards, leaping toward the American line with bayonets, swords, or whatever weapons they still held. Hand-to-hand combat flashed in pockets along the ridge. A Marine knocked down an attacker with the butt of his rifle. Another fought off 2 men at once, rolling in the dirt as they grappled for control of a blade. A bar gunner swung his weapon like a club when it ran dry, striking with the strength of a man fighting for his life. Tachovsky himself moved along the line, directing fire, repositioning shooters, and pulling wounded men back behind cover when he could. His leadership held the platoon together in the chaos, keeping their fire coordinated even as the wave pressed closer. The ridge burned with flashes of light. Smoke drifted in thick bands. Voices shouted orders, warnings, cries for ammunition, calls for medics. And through it all, the roar from the plane continued, but now tinged with something new. Strain, fatigue, pain. Because for the first time, the charge was slowing. And as the first great wave reached its breaking point against the ridge, the night was far from over. A second wave, larger, heavier, and reinforced by the remnants of Japanese tanks, was gathering in the darkness. The pause was brief, so brief that many Marines didn't notice it at first. The smoke, the flashes, the ringing in their ears blurred the battlefield into a single, continuous struggle. But Tachovsky noticed. He felt the shift in the air, the momentary slack in the enemy's momentum. The first Gyokusai wave had broken against the 40 Thieves' line like surf against rock. But surf always returned. He sensed the next impact before he saw it. A distant metallic clatter, a grinding, uneven growl, then another, and another. The sound rose over the moans and gunfire, a mechanical snarl that signaled a new horror rolling out of the night. "Tanks," muttered a corporal near the lieutenant, his voice low and tight. Not the armored columns the Marines had faced earlier in Saipan. Those had been formidable but predictable, advancing in formation with infantry support. What came now was something much stranger, more desperate. These were the wrecks of Saipan's armored battalions, patched with scrap metal and mud, engines coughing smoke, tracks clattering like broken bones. Some were missing turrets. Others had been turned into makeshift troop carriers, their hulls packed with soldiers clinging to any surface that would hold them. But to an exhausted line of Marines running low on ammunition, they looked like monsters crawling out of the dark. Behind and beside the tanks, more infantry surged forward, hundreds, maybe thousands, moving in a long, loose column. The second wave was less organized than the first, but no less dangerous. These men carried heavier weapons, machine guns, knee mortars, explosives, anything the Japanese command could scrape together for this final push. Tachovsky's platoon had a minute, maybe less. He raced to the nearest radio operator. "Get me battalion." The operator, face smeared with dirt and blood, twisted the dial and spoke urgently into the handset. Static crackled, voices overlapped. Then a reply broke through. "Send it, 40 Thieves. Tanks approaching our sector, multiple, infantry behind them. We need armor-piercing, artillery, anything you can give us." The reply came with grim honesty. "We are firing blind across half the line. You'll get what we have." A heartbeat later, the ground behind the ridge shook as American artillery opened up. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the advancing formations, throwing fire and soil high into the air. Some shells hit their marks, tanks erupted in flames, infantry units scattered. Others fell short or wide, exploding harmlessly. But the barrage didn't stop the wave, it only wounded it. The tanks kept coming. One of the nearest, limping on a damaged left track, angled clumsily toward the 40 Thieves section of the ridge. Its engine coughed, belched smoke, and surged forward. A squad of Japanese infantry ran beside it, using the armored hulk as moving cover. "Bazooka team," Tachovsky shouted. Two Marines rushed into position, kneeling to steady the tube. The loader shoved in a fresh round, slapped the firer's helmet, and ducked low. The Marine pulled the trigger. The rocket leapt from the tube with a streak of light, crossed the short distance, and slammed into the tank's front armor. The explosion flashed bright and then faded. The tank staggered but kept going, its armor too thick at that angle. "Hit it again, side armor." But before the team could reposition, machine gun fire from the infantry escorts stitched the dirt around them. The loader cried out as a bullet grazed his arm. Tachovsky grabbed the wounded man by the collar and dragged him behind a rock. The firer rolled to a new angle, braced himself, and fired again. This time the rocket punched through the tank's flank. The machine lurched, shuddered, and then erupted in flame as ammunition cooked off inside. The explosion ripped the turret loose and sent a plume of fire into the night. The Marines barely had time to cheer. Another tank came grinding in behind the first, this one carrying infantry clinging to its hull like barnacles. Riflemen fired upward, knocking several off, but more replaced them. The tank reached the foot of the ridge before a mortar round from a neighboring platoon landed squarely on top of it, blasting men and metal apart in a violent eruption. The second wave collapsed into chaos, but chaos was still deadly. Japanese infantry charged the ridge again, this time with knee mortars firing rapidly. Small, thumping blasts peppered the Marine positions. Shrapnel tore through the rocks. A machine gun team to the 40 Thieves left was hit hard, both gunners going down. Tachovsky saw the position falter. "Cover that gap." A squad from the 40 Thieves shifted instantly, firing into the Japanese, advancing through the new hole in the line. The bar gunner laid down a punishing stream of fire until his barrel began to glow. He switched weapons without hesitation, grabbing a fallen Marine's Garand to keep shooting. Still the Japanese climbed. A soldier appeared at the top of the slope, sprinting toward Tachovsky with a satchel charge held high. Two Marines shot him at the same time, but momentum carried the body forward, tumbling almost to the lieutenant's feet. He shoved the corpse away just before the satchel detonated, the blast throwing dust and stones into the air. Marines coughed, brushed debris from their eyes, and kept firing. The battle devolved into dozens of individual fights. A flamethrower operator unleashed a jet of fire into a cluster of attackers hiding behind a wrecked tank. A Japanese officer leapt onto the ridge, slashing with a sword until a Marine tackled him bodily off the edge. Grenades rolled down the slope and exploded, sending echoes across the plain. The 40 Thieves were battered, exhausted, bleeding, but the line held. Because even as the second wave crashed against the ridge, something shifted beyond the plain. The roar was fading. The tank engines sputtered out one by one. The infantry charges thinned. The men still running forward did so alone or in small, ragged groups, their momentum finally gone. The Gyokusai was burning itself out. But the night was not done with Tachovsky's men. As the surviving Japanese fell back into pockets of resistance, a new sound carried across the plain, smaller, more scattered, but unmistakable. Not a wave, not a charge. A series of frantic, suicidal infiltrations, men crawling low, creeping through grass, trying to slip between gaps in the line and reach the Marines in the dark. The 40 Thieves faced their final test of the night. They had to survive the infiltrators. Dawn came without warmth. It crept over Saipan slowly, spreading a dull grey light across the shattered cane fields and the smoking plain below the ridge. The shadows softened, the outlines of bodies, craters, broken tanks, and splintered equipment emerged with stark clarity, and for the first time in hours, the Marines could finally see what they had endured. The 40 Thieves had survived the infiltrators, but the final hours of darkness had been the most nerve-shredding of all. The charging waves were terrifying, but they were visible. They came in masses, shouting, surging, easy to target. Infiltrators were the opposite, silent, crawling through corpse piles, creeping through tall grass, slipping between rocks with knives, grenades, even sharpened bamboo stakes. All night the Marines fired at shadows, whispered warnings, and listened for footsteps that might or might not be there. A man could survive a Banzai charge through sheer adrenaline, but surviving a silent hunter in the dark demanded something different: discipline, restraint, and the ability to stay awake when every muscle begged to collapse. By sunrise, Tachovsky's men were hollow-eyed, coated in dust and dried blood. Their uniforms were torn, scorched, or missing entirely. Rifle barrels were blackened from heat. Some Marines had fought with spare bayonets after burning through ammunition. Others clutched captured Japanese weapons, still warm from use. They looked like they had aged years in a single night. As daylight strengthened, Tachovsky finally gave the order. "Stand by, we're sweeping the line." The platoon moved slowly, carefully, checking craters, tank hulls, and bodies with the mechanical precision of men who had fought too long to take chances. A wounded Japanese soldier could still be dangerous. A grenade could be tucked beneath a corpse. No one rushed. The full scale of the Gyokusai became clear as they advanced. Thousands of Japanese dead lay strewn across the plain in front of them, the remnants of the largest Banzai attack of World War II. Bodies filled trenches, spilled over embankments, and lay draped across the wrecks of tanks. Some held rifles, others clutched wooden clubs or demolition charges. The tracks of tanks were twisted and mangled, several hulls still burned, sending oily smoke into the morning air. Everywhere, the battlefield told the same story: desperation, courage, and annihilation. The Marines' own losses were significant. Entire pockets of the line had been nearly overrun. Medics worked frantically among the wounded, binding shattered limbs, stopping bleeding, administering morphine with hands that trembled from exhaustion. Officers moved from group to group, taking head counts, trying to reassemble units that had been shredded in the night. When Tachovsky's roster was finally tallied, the toll became real. Men he had dragged from the brig, men he had trained, men he had relied on, several were gone. Some were killed on the ridge. Others fell in the blind chaos of the infiltrator fights. A few lay wounded but alive, staring blankly at the sky as corpsmen worked over them. Yet the 40 Thieves had held. And not just held, they had anchored a portion of the line that, if broken, would have allowed the Banzai charge to roll straight into the rear of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Their position had not been symbolic, it had been decisive. As reports came in from other units, the scale of survival became clearer. Many companies had been overrun, hospital tents were attacked, artillery positions were assaulted, communications lines were cut. Some Marine and Army units fought with bayonets and shovels as the wave crashed against them. But the ridge had not fallen. And because it had not fallen, the Marines now controlled the field. By mid-morning, the 40 Thieves reached the edge of the plain where the Banzai charge had begun the night before. It looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, something cataclysmic. The sheer number of Japanese casualties stunned even battle-hardened men. One Marine whispered, "My God, they really came with everything." Tachovsky said nothing. He only stared across the field, taking in the enormity of what they had survived. The largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War was over, and its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The ridge was secure, but the emotional and strategic reckoning had only just begun. The morning of July 7th was quieter, but the silence carried weight. Across the northern plain of Saipan, the battlefield bore testimony not only to human endurance, but to unimaginable loss. Estimates later placed Japanese casualties during the night's Banzai charge at more than 3,000 dead, with hundreds more wounded, scattered across craters, tank hulls, and the burned-out cane fields. Entire units had been annihilated. Officers who had led the charge lay among their men, swords still clutched in stiffened hands. The Gyokusai was complete. American forces also suffered. Several companies along the ridge were depleted. Some squads had lost half their men. Medical personnel worked feverishly, administering morphine, stitching wounds, and performing triage under the relentless sun. Among the 40 Thieves, several Marines would not survive their injuries. Others were permanently scarred, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Yet the ridge had held, a fact confirmed in the first reports transmitted to battalion command. The strategic consequences were immediate. By halting the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, Tachovsky's men preserved the integrity of the American Northern Line. This prevented the Japanese from exploiting gaps that could have penetrated supply routes and disrupted reinforcements, artillery positions, and rear area command posts. The ridge became an anchor point, allowing American forces to reorganize, fortify, and prepare for the next phase of the campaign, the mopping up of northern Saipan, which would continue over the coming days. But beyond the tactical and strategic outcomes, the human cost shaped the narrative. Marines who survived described the night as an apocalyptic wave or living hell. Accounts highlight the psychological strain, the relentless roar of thousands, the unceasing barrage of fire, the proximity of death, and the moral weight of having to kill in hand-to-hand combat to survive. In interviews decades later, veterans recalled the fear, the adrenaline, and the bonds forged in the crucible of the Ridge, a unity that could only exist when life and death converged so starkly. Reports filed in the days after the engagement reflected both awe and gratitude. Battalion and regimental officers cited Tachovsky's leadership as decisive, emphasizing the platoon's discipline, bravery, and initiative. Some official dispatches noted that the platoon's performance had stopped what could have been a catastrophic breach, while war correspondents embedded with units called it a night when 40 men held a ridge against an empire. The event also revealed the stark contrasts of warfare in the Pacific. American firepower, technology, and training were critical, but so was small unit initiative, leadership, and the ability to adapt rapidly to unexpected threats. Tachovsky's men, drawn from the fringes of discipline, exemplified this principle. Their personal histories mattered less than their instincts, cohesion, and courage under extreme pressure. For Japanese forces, the Banzai was a final act of defiance. Saito, Nagumo, and surviving officers were either killed in the assault or committed ritual suicide, leaving the northern sector in disarray. The loss was catastrophic, eliminating organized resistance in that part of the island and accelerating the collapse of Japanese defensive capability across Saipan. By the afternoon, the 40 thieves had regrouped. They checked equipment, counted ammunition, and prepared for patrols that would sweep the remainder of the area. The ridge, once a point of imminent danger, now represented survival, victory, and for those who stood there, the thin line between life and death. It was a landscape forever altered by strategy, by courage, and by the sheer weight of human determination. And yet, even as the field fell silent and the survivors caught their breath, the psychological and historical reverberations of the night would echo far beyond Saipan. Because the ridge they had held, against overwhelming numbers, under intense pressure, in the darkest hours of the campaign, would come to symbolize not only the brutality of the Pacific War, but the extraordinary capacity of individuals and small units to influence the course of history. That ridge and the 40 men who defended it had changed the battle, and the battle had changed them. War distills humanity into extremes. On that ridge in northern Saipan, 40 men faced what no human should face: thousands of enemies, overwhelming odds, and the raw immediacy of life and death. There were no narratives of heroism to frame their actions, no fanfare to soften the cost. There was only clarity, the clarity of survival, the clarity of duty, and the clarity of consequence. Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky's decision to rely on misfits and men with Brig records was not unconventional because it sought novelty, it was unconventional because it worked. In chaos, when doctrine falters and firepower alone cannot determine outcomes, the human element, instinct, initiative, trust, becomes decisive. These 40 men held more than a ridge. They held a line in the history of the Pacific War, proving that courage, cohesion, and calculated audacity could turn the tide against numbers, machinery, and momentum. The battle also exposes the duality of warfare. For the Japanese soldiers, the Gyokusai was an act of honor, a testament to devotion and obedience, yet it was also an act of tragedy, a deliberate movement into death with the hope of meaning. For the Americans, it was survival, strategy, and sacrifice intertwined. Both sides confronted mortality in its starkest form. The lessons are stark. Technology and numbers shape the battlefield, but human will shapes history. Beyond strategy, beyond tactics, the ridge represents something enduring about humanity under pressure. It is a story of trust, in leaders, in comrades, in oneself. It is a story of adaptation, of learning to fight not as a singular warrior, but as a living network of intent. It is a story of the cost of war and the heights of courage that emerge when ordinary men are pushed to the edge. As the sun rises over Saipan, illuminating the fields still scarred by fire and death, one image remains: 40 men, exhausted, bloodied, and alive, standing on a ridge against the storm of an empire. Their victory was not celebrated in parades or headlines at the time. It was measured in survival, in a line held, in a charge stopped, in a moment that proved the improbable was possible. The ridge endures, not only in maps or reports, but in memory. And in that memory, the lesson of Saipan lingers. that the courage of a few at the right place and the right time can shape the course of history forever.